Hello, hello, hello. All right, welcome to the Daily Faded, the first daytime Daily Faded. And oddly enough, even though it's the middle of the day, you can't see me. I actually had to mount a work light on my laptop. Maybe if I just turn it a little bit, is that better? Is that better? There's literally no light without that. I'm completely in the shade because everything's blown out behind me. Okay, all right, whatever. That doesn't really matter. So thank you guys for, look at that. I got 3. Even in the middle of the day, I got 3. That's awesome. Awesome. Okay, great. Let me know, guys, if there are any dropouts like you experienced the other night. So it's a pleasure to smoke in the middle of the day, like a nice leisurely Friday in quarantine, I guess. And the one thing this shows me is I really need to build a studio in my backyard because I can never get good lighting on my patio at night, during the day, never. Anyway, for some reason, oh, I see what happened. All right, I'm sorry it's taken me a while to get going. I hope you'll stick with me. We're going to talk about politics. I wrote down a lot of notes for last night's show. And then I couldn't do the show last night because I was I wasn't feeling well last night, so I wasn't able to do the show. So, but I'm here now. It's nice and warm. I'm actually sweating. I don't know. Can you see the sweat on my head? It's over 80 degrees outside in beautiful North Hollywood. And I still can't get my notes to update so that I can start doing this. Hold on 1 second. I'm just trying to pull up my notes. There we go. All right. I don't know how much time you guys have. We're in the middle of a quarantine. And that generally means maybe you have a lot of time. I don't know. Maybe you have work to do. But I'm going to take my time with this one because I wrote a lot of notes and I want to go through them all. So I hope you can hang out for the duration. That would be awesome. And again, I apologize for the fact that you can hardly see my face. That is clearly not good YouTubing. But that said, I've been learning some things and this stream is going to start improving. Anyway, so let's get into it. First, let's talk about... Anyway, let me see if I can get this up on my iPad. I need more computers. I need more technology. And I need more patrons. I am very grateful to my patrons. Thank you very much for subscribing. See, I've already lost everyone. It's just down to 1. All right, so we're at 1.7 or 1.8 million worldwide. In the United States, we're at 894,034 confirmed cases of COVID-19. And we're up to 50,919 deaths. So we're quickly approaching COVID-19 killing more Americans than Vietnam. We are quickly approaching that. I do want to issue a little correction over something I said, I think on Wednesday or Tuesday, which was I was talking about the fact that our testing quantity had plateaued at 150,000 tests or thereabout a day, 150, 160,000. But then as of last night, within the previous 48 hours, and I want to cite David Pakman. I saw this on his live stream of the president's press briefing yesterday. Over the previous 48 hours, we had tested north of 500,000 people. So that was the first major jump. And those two, one day was over 300 and the other one was like 190 or something like that. Those 2 days were the two largest testing days that we've had. So I don't know, Cisco, which combined had 23 confirmed cases on March 1st. Quote, but according to the Northeastern model, there could have actually been about 28,000 infection in those cities by then. So supposedly they had 23, and it looks like they may have had as many as 28,000 infections. They're modeling that Boston had 2,300, Seattle had 2,300, Chicago had 3,300, San Francisco had 9,300, and New York City had 10,700. This is in February prior to the caseloads going up. It's already been proven that the first coronavirus death was in California on February 6th, more than 3 weeks before the previously stated first death, which was originally February 29th. So now we know that the first coronavirus death was on February 6th. If I remember correctly, they said the person was not sick that long, but it could be up to 14 days before the onset of symptoms. So if you go from February 6th, you're now in the third week of January that person caught it from someone, and the person had not traveled to China and had no known contacts that had traveled to China. So that means someone in California got the virus by community spread in the third week of January. So that's unfortunate. But it's interesting and important information. Quote from the New York Times article, as political leaders grappled in February with the question of whether the outbreak would become serious enough to order measures like school closures and remote work, little or no systematic testing for the virus was taking place. Meanwhile, in the background, you have this silent chain of transmission of thousands of people, said Alessandro Vespignani, director of the Network Science Institute at Northeastern University in Boston, who led the research team. Quote, through February 27th, this country only had 14 cases, Dr. Robert Redfield, director of the CDC, said during a briefing. That's the same Dr. Redfield who we saw apologizing for correctly stating that the second wave could be worse than the first wave at the press briefing on Wednesday. So Dr. Robert Redfield said, through February 27th, this country only had 14 cases. And what this study is showing is that there were at least 28,000 infections in 5 cities, meaning there were a lot more than 28,000 infections and a lot more than 14 cases around the country. Redfield went on during a briefing. We did that. This was not for the article. This was during a briefing. Quote, we did that isolation and that contact tracing, and it was very successful. But then when the virus was exploding, it got beyond the public health capacity, which just on the face of it begs for criticism of the CDC director, Redfield, because he says there were only 14 cases. We did contact tracing, we tamped it down, and then it exploded. Well, clearly you didn't do a very good job. And clearly the virus is around. In contrast, Dr. Adriana Hegway said, quote, we weren't testing, and if you're not testing, you don't know. The new estimates suggesting that thousands of infections were spreading silently in the first months of the year, quote, don't seem surprising at all, she said. So there were plenty of people who knew that this disease was all over America in February, and by extension in January. And the CDC director was telling us that there were 14 cases, and Donald Trump was telling us that there were 15 cases and it was going to go down to 0. Yet they knew. Everybody knew. Hell, man, I knew. I remember on February 2nd, South Korea, Singapore, Taiwan, he defended it. Surgeon General defended what he had said as the best scientific evidence at the time, but he was clearly wrong. All of a sudden, I have 3 people. That's weird. Maybe they'll come back on. And they're back. All right, welcome back. That was strange. I've never seen YouTube just kick people off like that. Clearly, William Barr is now running YouTube. So when he said, no, people shouldn't wear masks because that doesn't protect them from catching the virus, he should have said, yes, you should wear it because it will protect others from getting the virus from you. So frankly, both Jerome Adams and Robert Redfield were dead wrong in February. And I do think there should be accountability. I don't know if that accountability should come right now, because I don't trust Trump to replace these people. If Fauci could replace Redfield, I would appreciate that, but I'm sure Fauci wouldn't do that. I don't mean Fauci take the position at the CDC. I think Fauci is fine where he is. But they should get Michael Osterholm. I love that guy. If you haven't seen his episode of Joe Rogan, check out Joe Rogan's interview of Michael Osterholm. He's an epidemiologist from Minnesota, and it's amazing. According to Mercury News on April 2nd, quote, Dr. Robert Redfield, director of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in Atlanta, said in mid-February that asymptomatic transmission of coronavirus was possible. Furthermore, studies from as early as January showed cases of coronavirus spreading amongst people with no symptoms. As early as January. And I want you to remember a couple of weeks ago when Brian Kemp finally did stay-at-home orders in Georgia. I don't remember how long ago that was. It's all one day now. He said that we just found out yesterday that there's asymptomatic spread. No, dude, you're not paying attention. You're not a good governor because you're not paying attention. Tanya, tell me, can you actually see my face? Just curious. So they had the goddamn science to know about face masks, and they had the goddamn science to know that it was already all over the place. Trump loves to talk about the China ban, but the genetic evidence that people have done researching the viral strains that people have contracted in New York and the Northeast suggests that those viral strains that are killing people in New York came mostly from Italy and from Europe, not from China. So every time Trump brags about the China lockdown, he's full of shit because it didn't help. It didn't help at all. So he shouldn't brag about that any more than he should brag about hydroxychloroquine, which turns out to have a greater death rate, at least in one limited study, gives you a greater death rate, not a lower death rate, if you get hydroxychloroquine while you're in the hospital for COVID-19. Yet another example of them putting something before science, in that case, pharmaceuticals. We're buying 20 million, 200 million, however many million. Was it 100 million? I don't know. They bought a lot of hydroxychloroquine, and now it's useless. And there's a lot of big pharma companies that make chloroquine, and they all donate to Donald Trump. So that's why I think he was pushing it, because it was good for business and good for re-election. So in a perfect world, I think Redfield and Adams would both be shit-canned. But Donald Trump would probably hire a MAGA hat-wearing billionaire, dressage champion, maybe, or maybe not dressage. He hates Mitt Romney, so maybe not dressage. This also points to the dangers of reopening, especially when we've tested less than 1% of the population. We need to be testing asymptomatic people by the millions. Every healthcare provider in the country should be doing a COVID-19 test whenever someone comes through the door right now, regardless of their symptoms. That would be the kind of surveillance and sentinel testing that Dr. Deborah Birx has talked about several times. maybe if we did that amount of testing, we would find out that the outbreak is really under control. Right now, we have no idea of how much asymptomatic spread is out there. Now, connected to this, and we also go back to our issue of contact tracers. Remember that the CDC has 1,250 contact tracers, and people are saying that we need between, I've seen between 100,000 and 300,000 contact tracers. We certainly need more than 1,250. Related to this, Andrew Cuomo tweeted yesterday about the result of an antibody test that they did in New York. They did a random study of 3,000 people at people who go to supermarkets in New York. The data has its shortcoming. It's not controlled and so on and so forth. And it is a random sample, so you don't know what comorbidities or I guess comorbidities wouldn't really matter because you're testing asymptomatic, but you don't know what different metrics people fall into when it's a random sample like that. But still, 21% tested positive for COVID-19 in New York City. So they tested random people in New York City who had no symptoms, and 21% of them tested positive. 14% tested positive statewide. If you extrapolate that out, that's 1.7 million people in New York City alone being positive for COVID-19, and 2.6 million people being positive statewide. This data would suggest a 0.5% fatality rate, by the way, which is the one thing. The more people who are infected asymptomatically, the lower the fatality rate. Now I'm going to get to Trump. Boy, yesterday was wackadoodle. It was bizarro. Trump goes on longer tangents than I do, and he forgets what he's talking about more often than I do, and I'm stoned. I mean, come on, give me a break, man. Can't you do better than that? Two big things that I took away from Trump yesterday, because I'm trying not to pay much attention to most of what he says. When I'm watching, I just go, okay, lie, and then try and pay attention to the more bizarre things. So the big announcement, Trump always wants to be upselling the pandemic. He wants to be upselling what's going on. So he's always talking about how we're almost through it. The day before yesterday, he was talking about how there is going to be no second wave, and he tried to get everyone to agree that there would be no second wave, but they all kind of had to say, well, Fauci at least said there will be a second wave. So yesterday, Trump's big positive news, his new hydroxychloroquine, was a test done by the Science and Technology Directorate at Homeland Security. And this dude comes out, I guess the Undersecretary for Homeland Security for Science and Technology. And he talks about how they had this custom tank, and they put this virus in the tank, and they checked different conditions to see how the virus responds to those conditions and what would happen. And the big takeaway was that the virus's half-life got shorter and shorter, and this mostly matters for surfaces, but the virus's half-life got shorter and shorter as the heat went up and when it was exposed to humidity and sunlight. Now, from this, Trump went to saying to Dr. Birx and to this guy from Homeland Security, whose name I didn't even write down. He was such a thug. He just looked like a bruiser. I don't believe for a second that he's a scientist. I'm sure he's a hotelier who donated $1 million to the Trump campaign. And by the way, it was an acting undersecretary of Homeland Security, because there's no one who's actually been confirmed in the Trump White House anymore. But Trump turns to Birx and the thug and says, well, we could get And the other thing the thug had said was that disinfectants kill it. Great, that's good news. And it's good news that sunlight kills it. Great. But Trump goes and he says, couldn't we get the light and the heat and the disinfectant outside the body and inside the body? And I was watching Pac-Man's stream, and I literally thought to myself, is he asking them if we can kill COVID-19 with a tanning bed? And seconds later, David Pac-Man went, tanning bed. Sounds like he's talking about tanning beds. I swear to God, I had the thought before David Pac-Man said it. I'm not lifting from Pac-Man. But shout out to Pac-Man for agreeing with me. Anyway, as if he'll ever see this. As if anyone could see it. Maybe it looks like it's getting a little bit better as the sun moves west. So it literally sounds... So Trump was talking about putting disinfectant, I don't know, into your lungs to kill COVID-19. Deborah Birx just looked dumbfounded. And, and every public health official in America seems to have come out and said you can't use disinfectant. Lysol issued a statement saying, please do not ingest Lysol or any other disinfectant, as they can be deadly. And then the other big talking point from yesterday was blue state bailouts. They asked him about Mitch McConnell saying, let the states go bankrupt. And I guess the new right-wing talking point is that providing money for states is a blue state bailout, which I find to be hilarious, given that the blue states are the ones that pay the majority of the taxes in this country, and the red states get more back than they pay in taxes, and the blue states get less back than they pay in taxes. So, but on the flip side, what Mitch McConnell said is on its face ridiculous. As my buddy pointed out, are you going to let the fifth largest economy on the planet Earth go bankrupt? It doesn't make any sense. So calling it a blue state bankrupt and weaponizing blue state versus red state when you're talking about pandemic relief is really fucking disgusting. It's really disgusting. But it goes along with this myth that the right has been talking about forever, which is that, cities with all the problems have Democratic mayors. So it's all problems in blue cities, which is just bullshit. It just so happens that the largest metropolitan areas in America are all Democrat because urban people are frequently Democratic voters. They're less frequently Republican voters. The suburbs and rural is a different thing. So that whole blue state bailouts thing was pretty offensive and pretty annoying, but I'm sure we're going to be dealing with that for a while. Now for a little bit of good news from yesterday, which means I have to smoke. Can you see me better back here? Should I sit back like this? Can you see me better back here? I don't think so. The other thing is I can't see because I have this bright light bulb in my eyes. Anyway, so the Gavin Newsom signed an executive order. He announced this yesterday, preventing the garnishing of federal relief money by any kind of debt collectors. And I think this includes banks. So he basically said it is illegal in California for any debt of any kind to take the debt relief money that people received. And included in the executive order is a requirement that any debt collectors who garnished the check or the payment, those debt collectors have to pay it back. So I thought, well, that's progressive leadership again, and that should have been stipulated in the original CARES Act, because it's ridiculous to give people $1,200. I mean, what if you're overdrafted $50 or $100 or $200, and now you only get $1,000 instead of $1,200, and even the $1,200 wasn't enough to pay? The idea that that your first priority should be paying back creditors instead of buying food is absurd. So that should have been built into the CARES Act to begin with, and progressives should have fucking fought for it. The Los Angeles City Council voted Wednesday. I think this is from the LAist. The Los Angeles City Council voted Wednesday to create a program to help people pay their rent during the COVID-19 pandemic. Initially set up with $2.2 million, the fund is for families that are struggling to pay their rent and are living paycheck to paycheck, said City Council President Nuri Martinez, who co-sponsored the motion with Councilman Herb Wesson. A report from the city's housing department lays out the details of the fund. It will be available to tenants making 80% or less of their area's median income. Tenants will have to document the economic toll the pandemic has taken on their finances. Money paid out will go directly to landlords and will cover up to half a month's rent, with a maximum of $1,000 per month and $3,000 over the life of the program. Based on the estimate from the city housing department, the $2.2 million could help several hundred families. So we at DSA LA were pressuring the city council members to go much further than this and issue, you know, a 12-month or a 3-month or whatever eviction moratorium. So we were pushing for a lot more than this, something that would help every renter in Los Angeles. This is problematic. This is good because it will help several hundred families. So that's good. So I'm glad the city council passed at least this. And there are big issues with the budget. So I'm sure they feel constrained as to how much they can spend. That said, I'd rather the city go further into debt to make sure people don't get kicked out of their apartments. So here's something else I saw that I really wanted to talk about last night, which is Michael Bloomberg is back in the news nominally. Excuse me. And if it's Bloomberg time, I'm actually going to change my thing. I've got like a whole handful of them. I can't show them to the camera. I'm sure you wanted to see my drug collection, right? Anyway, Michael Bloomberg. I'm going back to green crack, best daytime weed there is. Michael Bloomberg has committed $10 million to testing and tracing in New York. He spent over $1 billion in 104 days of campaigning to be president. Over $1 billion he spent on his completely pointless campaign. Because even in the end, I think his campaign was intended to sink Elizabeth Warren and or Bernie Sanders. I think that's the reason he did it, because they're an existential threat to someone like Bloomberg. And but even that, I don't think he didn't take a bite out of Bernie, that's for sure. And Elizabeth Warren took lots of big bites out of him. I mean, she mauled him in the debates. She absolutely mauled him. And so it was really a waste of money, that $1 billion. So now he's going to spend $10 million in New York to fund testing. He should probably spend $10 billion. Think about it. The Congress just passed $25 billion in testing. Again, I don't think that act is good enough, but I'm glad they got $25 billion for testing. If Michael Bloomberg came out and said $10 billion for testing in the Northeast, in the tri-state area, whatever, he wouldn't notice it. He wouldn't have to sell one of his houses or one of his yachts in order to do it. It wouldn't make any difference at all. What is he worth? $65 billion, $60 billion? So now he's worth $50 billion or $55 billion instead. I don't, 10 million is not enough. And this is the problem. It's a perfect illustration of why, in my humble opinion, there should be no billionaires. None. According to the Brookings Institute, the wealthiest 1% in America is worth $25 trillion. The wealthiest 1% in America is holding on to $25 trillion in wealth, which is more certainly than the bottom 80%, if not more than that. What if the top 1% were only worth 5 trillion? What if we had policies? What if we taxed wealth? And what if we taxed income? And what if we taxed corporations at the rate we need to tax them to generate funds to use for social programs? What if we decided having billionaires is not a good money? You see, the thing is that if you said, okay, that 1%, instead of being worth 25 trillion, we had laws in place that means they're only worth 5 trillion, but that other 20 trillion that they earned was now part of the public good. Think about that. The top 1% are holding on to $25 trillion. Why do they need $25 trillion? The answer is they fucking don't. I think we should have 100% wealth tax over $1 billion. You get to $1 billion, congratulations, you won at the game of life. You won the American dream. You became a billionaire. Now you're done. Everything else that you make goes to the government. Now, does that disincentivize people to work? Maybe, but a billionaire doesn't need to work anyway. So, he can go about making other people billionaires. But everything in capitalism that furthers the concentration of wealth, and that's what we're, with our taxation policies, that's what we're allowing, is to further the concentration of wealth in private hands. Because corporations are not people, but the people who run corporations are people. And so all of this money ends up, this $25 trillion in the 1%'s hands. So all the things in capitalism that further the concentration of wealth, so low wages, tax havens, tax cuts, stock buybacks, obscene executive compensation packages, wage slavery, deregulation, monopolization, oligopolies, anti-competitive practices of any kind, takes money that could be used to serve the public good and funnels it to the top 1%. Funnels it to people having unnecessary yachts, planes, helicopters, and 10 or 15 houses, or however many houses those people have. Bloomberg is such a job creator. Let him use the billions of dollars to put people to work doing unprofitable work. And that's what we need to do right now, is we need to be paying people to do unprofitable work. We need to be paying labs to do testing, and we need to cut the profit motive out of it. We need to be paying contact tracers to contact trace people who are tested positive. And you don't make any money from a contact tracer, but that's what's in good of the American people. It's what's needed to control the pandemic. There are a ton of important workers in our society whose work isn't profitable, but is a value to society. That's why we need what I would even call right now a confiscatory policy, because if I was the king of America, I would confiscate the money. Yes, so I do have an autocratic streak. I am a democratic socialist, but sometimes the idea of having enough power to just make it so is appealing. But given that I hate the autocracy of Trump, and I hate the autocracy of our whole system, I have to try and hold on to my democratic ideals. So that money has just been stolen from workers and consumers. That's all it is. It's just theft. And it belongs in the public treasury. I don't know about you, But I would prefer, when you're talking about that level of money, that amount of money, I would prefer to have at least nominally democratically elected representatives deciding what to do with the money. I don't really think we live in a democracy. If we did, we would want democratically elected people who are, and at least the House and Senate do answer to the people to some degree. Money and propaganda helps them an awful lot, and gerrymandering and a lot of things help them. But the idea that quantity of money, that amount of money that becomes part of the public good, is now answerable to the public instead of just being a fund money fund for rich people. And they could still have their yachts and their helicopters and their multiple hospital houses and their endless exotic vacations if they only have $500 million in wealth, or 900,000, or $1 billion. So I really think it's time for a socialist revolution in America. And I don't know how to I don't know how to do that. I do not believe in violent revolution. I only believe in peaceful revolution. And I was just talking to a friend of mine at DSA the other day, and we simply need to reach more people, and we need to help more people understand that they're living under the yoke of capitalism and that it doesn't have to be the way it is. I'm not saying privatize. I'm not saying nationalize every industry. I don't believe in that. I do believe there should be a fair market for consumer goods and services. And I'm okay with certain things remaining in the private sector. But there are some things that need to be nationalized. Healthcare needs to be nationalized. Prisons need to be nationalized. And the fossil fuel companies need to be nationalized so we can get them on a road to shutting them down by 2030. That's the problem, is everything's so urgent. Everything is so urgent that if I could just go do it with an AK-47, but I can't because I don't believe in violence. This must be violent weed I'm smoking. I don't think there is such a thing as violent weed. Maybe if it's laced with PCP or something like that. Anyway, on the path that we're on, wealth simply continues to concentrate in fewer and fewer hands who are less and less answerable to society. It's great that Michael Bloomberg is spending $10 million, but it's the equivalent of me spending 10 cents, if not a penny. It's nothing. So, yay, I'm glad they got the extra funding. I'm sure it's going to help a lot of people, but I don't like relying on billionaires for their mercy when we have a legislature that won't pass the kind of relief bill that the people actually need. So the only thing we have to rely on is billionaires. I don't like relying on billionaires. I don't think we should have to. Look, yesterday, and actually Wednesday night, Rashida Tlaib was on Chris Hayes. Switching subjects now. Rashida Tlaib was on Chris Hayes. She argued for grants to localities, for no water shutoffs. She was arguing this should all be in the Senate bill that passed yesterday. Firefighters, first responders in her district getting COVID-19 with no aid and no support, so more support to first responders. Local governments can't be allowed to fail because they're the ones who will be administering whatever the federal policies are. So she was arguing for money for municipalities and local governments, recurring direct payments to individuals throughout the duration of the crisis, which I also support. Making sure that frontline communities are not ignored. But once again, just like AOC, all she did was blame the Republicans. She didn't mention that Democratic leadership was not interested in fighting for any of these things. Hold on, the dogs are going crazy. Luckily, it doesn't take long to quiet them usually. So it was the same. She was playing the same game, the Republican bad game. Like I said before, as long as AOC or Ilhan Omar or Rashida Tlaib or Ayanna Pressley or Ro Khanna or Pramila Jayapal or Mark Pocan, as long as any of these progressive legislators are constantly doing Nancy Pelosi's bidding, I don't know how we make any change. I don't know how we move forward. Now, am I saying that it needs to be an all-out war with Nancy Pelosi? No, I don't think that would be wise either. But I do think it would be important to exert some pressure on the Democrats and some public pressure. AOC argued passionately on the floor Thursday, and it was great. It was 30 seconds that she had to argue. And, and she said, we have to fight to fund hospitals, to fund testing. That is what we're fighting for in this bill. It is unconscionable. If you had any urgency, you would legislate like rent is due on May 1st and make sure that we include rent and mortgage relief for our constituents. So bully for AOC. Great argument. Dogs! Sorry, I hope that wasn't too loud. Ludwig! Sorry about that. So I forgot where I am. That's what happens when you smoke weed and do politics and news. So I think this is the last thing I'm going to talk about today. I had something I was going to say about some other YouTubers, but I don't think anyone watching this watches other political YouTubers. Let me know in the comments if I'm wrong. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about Bernie Sanders and the Not Me Us movement. And this is an addendum to my earlier commentary on Bernie last week. But I think the real big question that we're asking ourselves, and to credit of a lot of people on the left, particularly on the online left, a lot of them are now talking about, well, how do we keep the movement together? How do we keep the movement going forward? Do we need to pick, some people think we need to know who our, next electoral heir is. So we need to decide AOC is going to be the candidate in 2024 and start campaigning for her right now or something like that. And yes, I do think she's old enough in 2024, just barely. And I'm not saying AOC for president. Ludwig. Sorry. At the end of the day, an insider can't. I want to put aside the electoral strategy question, because I don't think it's the most important question right now. We have figured out now that an insider can't really take on the establishment as long as he or she are within that establishment and beholden to that establishment. And that's exactly what we see with Rashida Tlaib and AOC consistently going after Republicans and hands off of Democrats, even though the disagreements they have with Democrats are in some ways more important than the disagreements with Republicans, because we need our allies to be our allies on true progressive goals that will actually help people. So for Bernie Sanders, I do think the political revolution is over. And frankly, even though I'm one who likes the idea of revolution, I'm not sure we should talk about political revolution again. I'm not sure that should be part of the lexicon. Bernie used it in 2 campaign cycles, and he didn't win either campaign. That said, he certainly didn't have a fair shot in the first one. And a variety of forces were arrayed against him in the second presidential campaign. But that political revolution language did not bring more people into Bernie's fold. And if anything, he got fewer votes in like Super Tuesday states than like in Michigan, so it may have alienated people. And the overthrow of the status quo may not be the best language to win votes, to win average Americans onto the progressive agenda, because when you break down the economic issues to most voters, the average American, they generally support progressive issues, and not only economic ones. The majority of Americans support legalizing cannabis, as do I. Luckily, I'm privileged. I live in California, so I don't really have to worry about it. But, you know, we saw it in the polling of the primary states. The Democratic primary electorate supported Medicare for all. It was over 50% and over 60% in a lot of places, but it was well over 50% in most places. So we know that the policies are actually policies people are interested in. People don't want to fucking deal with their private insurance company anymore. They fucking hate their insurance companies. And if we could convince them of that, we have to figure out how to figure out how to make them understand that they'll be better off in a Medicare for all system, that it will cost less and they'll have better quality care. And they won't have to do any more forms, and they won't have to do any more requests, and so on and so forth. So we need to figure out the messaging in the progressive movement. And I would argue we even need to figure out the messaging in the democratic socialist movement. So those are two things, but I'll just stick to the progressive movement for now. I actually think the language Elizabeth Warren was using in the late spring to early summer of 2019 was very smart language. One of the things that she did that I think Elizabeth Warren made a lot of very poor choices in her campaign, but I think the first half was notably better than the second half. And the first half is how she rose in the polls. You know, in July or August, she was ahead in the polls in 2019. So what was she messaging? Well, she was talking a lot about the history of the labor struggle in America. She was talking a lot about the history of the government doing things that actually helps people. You know, she talked about a famous, I think, laundry fire. I don't remember the details of that particular historical incident, but a lot of protest and labor rights came out of that from one particular leader whose name escapes me at the moment. And then she came up with the branding, I'm a Warren Democrat. The best thing Bernie Sanders could have done before the 2020 primary was say, when I saw I'm a Warren Democrat, I thought, God damn it, that's good PR. That's good marketing. That's a good way to try and include people. And I like Not Me, Us a lot. I wouldn't do anything with Not Me, Us. But if I was Bernie Sanders in 2019 or early 2020, I think looking back, and this is the 2020 of hindsight, right? I think one of the best things he could have done was say, our ideas have won the day. Our ideas are the most popular. And that's how the Democratic primary electorate feels. The polling has been clear. So I'm now declaring myself a member of the Democratic Party. And he registers as a Democrat. And he says, I've changed my mind. Now that Democrats agree with me, now that the party is where I've moved it to, I'm a Democrat and I want you to join me and be a Sanders Democrat. I think that would have been extremely powerful. And I think it would have helped him in a variety of ways. One, he identifies as a Democrat. He doesn't talk about the Democratic establishment. He fights it, but he doesn't talk about it. And again, he takes it on and he challenges them on the issues. But he doesn't say, I'm taking on the Democratic establishment for a very specific reason, which is I think there are a lot of voters who say, what is the Democratic establishment? Well, I always vote Democrat, so that must be me. So I think the language of taking on the Democratic establishment, along with the language of the political revolution, I don't think that was good messaging for 2020, and I don't think that was helping Bernie Sanders. The second thing in 2020 hindsight, again, stealing this idea from Elizabeth Warren, is if they had come up with this idea of I'm a Sanders Democrat, and you get every Bernie Sanders follower to do a Twitter video saying I'm a Sanders Democrat, is that you hear Sanders Democrat, Sanders Democrat. You take away that argument. So first, you change the Democratic establishment language. Then you say to vote for Bernie Sanders is Democratic because he is a Democrat, and the Democratic Party now agrees with Bernie. A lot of them didn't agree in 2016, but they agree with him now in 2020. The Democratic voters agree with Bernie. And then there's a third benefit that I think Sanders Democrat would have had, which is it would have put the idea of President Sanders into people's heads. And I think that's extremely valuable. I'm not sure. No one's ever really referred to Donald Trump as Donald except for people who know him. But everybody refers to Bernie Sanders as Bernie. People generally spoke of Elizabeth Warren as Elizabeth Warren or as Warren. The New York Times reports Bernie Sanders as Sanders. I think it's good. I think it's good to use the last name so that you get that idea of President Sanders. And to the degree that Elizabeth Warren in 2019 was talking about the history of struggle, and she was doing so successfully. And that speech she gave in New York was phenomenal, where she had the big crowd in New York at, I forget the name of the park, but it's the one that was right by a laundry place or factory or whatever it was that had burned down. She was talking about the history of progressive change in the Democratic Party, and that is a great history, and Bernie talked about it as well, but not enough. Not enough. The more he should have said every single debate, FDR, JFK, LBJ, and Ted Kennedy all supported single-payer healthcare. It is a grand tradition in the Democratic Party, and it is cheaper than the system we have now. He should have said that every time. He should have said it over and over and over again and made it what it is, which is a core Democratic principle that everyone gets healthcare. That's a core Democratic principle, going back at least to FDR. Although earlier presidents had some pretty progressive ideas as well. Some. There, I think, like Harrison, I don't know, one of the random presidents you never hear talked about was extremely progressive, almost socialist. But it's, I think, one of the presidents who died, was assassinated after a week or two. But the unique, struggle. So Bernie did say that the struggles have led to political change. So he would cite women's suffrage, the New Deal, the accomplishments of movement politics in the 60s and in the 70s, and even all the way up, into the 90s and the 2000s. And he would talk about things like the New Deal and the Voting Rights Act and the war on poverty, but he never really. He never put all the pieces together in the right way. Mind you, everything I'm saying is speculation. It's all speculation. I haven't test grouped this with anyone. But I've read a lot and heard a lot of opinions on the movement and on the Sanders campaign. And frankly, I wanted to take my time and really think about it to kind of figure out what made the most sense to me. But the movement must continue, but new leadership must evolve. And that new leadership could come from within the movement. It could be AOC, it could be Ro Khanna, or it could still come from outside of the movement, from someone who's more of a Democratic stalwart like Gavin Newsom, who, as evidenced by the actions he's been taking in California during the pandemic, is very much on our side. He is this is someone who made $125 million in relief aid available to undocumented Americans. That is an extremely progressive thing to do. First, a direct payment in relief aid is progressive inherently, and to do so for the undocumented is even more progressive. I believe the state of California is covering anyone's COVID-19 treatment who doesn't have insurance. So we know that Gavin's heart is in the place of everyone having health care. Look, FDR was not a progressive when he ran for president in 1932. He mostly ran against Hoover. His campaign may have had more in common with Hillary Clinton's 2016 campaign, because it was all about how bad a job Hoover had done with the Great Depression. It wasn't until he got into office and began to realize the scope of the problems and was under a ton of pressure from the American Communist Party, the two socialist parties, or is it two communist parties? I can't remember, and the labor union movement, who all said, we got you elected and we won't let you get reelected if you don't help the workers, if you don't help the people. So the Communist Party and the Socialist Party and the labor union movement, they had a big influence on FDR, and a lot of people don't know about that. The commies and the socialists get written out of history all the time, and we've done everything in our power as a society to destroy the labor movement. So obviously labor doesn't have the kind of influence today that it used to have, and I wish it did. I wish it did. I often disagree with labor leaders, but I agree with labor union. I disagree with labor union leaders, but I agree with labor movement leaders, and I agree with union membership, generally speaking. But it doesn't matter. The point is that these outside forces put pressure on FDR, much in the same way that MLK put pressure on Lyndon Johnson. So we have those movements in place, right? And some of them are movements that have been around for a long time, like the LGBTQIA plus movement, like women's rights movements, pro-choice movement. A lot of those movements are the movements that are already acceptable to corporate Democrats because they don't hurt the corporate bottom line. But the newer movements, the WTO protest that became big in the early 2000s, Occupy Wall Street was very important. A lot of the networks that were built in the Occupy movement, from New York to LA to Seattle and so on, a lot of those networks became those networks, the email chains and the phone chains and so on and so forth, they became the Draft Warren network in 2014 and 2015, and they were trying to draft Elizabeth Warren, and Elizabeth Warren wouldn't run, and so they moved on and they drafted Bernie Sanders, and that's a big part of how Bernie Sanders ended up running for president in 2016. So there are direct ties to the Occupy movement. But we've also got these recent movements that are so important. We've had the Fight for 15. We've had the successful labor union strikes, particularly the teacher strikes all over the country. We've had the school strike for climate justice, Greta Thunberg, the March for Our Lives, the kids from Stoneman Douglas High, all of this new energy in the broader progressive movement, the criminal justice movement, Black Lives Matter, the Medicare for All movement is itself its own separate movement with leaders like the National Nurses United and Wendell Potter and people like that. So we've got the movements. We just need to continue to expand them. We've got the DSA, we've got Justice Democrats, we've got Our Revolution. We have to continue to get all of these different movements to talk to each other and work together. And by the way, they do a very good job of doing that. So So that's why movement pressure on an otherwise standard Democratic politician like someone like Gavin Newsom, that may be the best short-term strategy. That's not going to get us to the level of wealth redistribution that I personally would like to see happen in our country, but it would, our short-term goals would be in agreement. And this is, this is like, one thing that really disgusted me, and I'll finish up soon because my back hurts. Because I'm leaning forward instead of sitting in a comfortable chair. Joe Biden did an ad recently that showed the crowds for each presidential candidate cheering them on, showed each candidate being cheered on. And it came along with like, we are the movement. It went through all the presidential candidates up through Warren, and then Bernie was last, and then Joe Biden, as if to say all of those movements, if you can even call them movements, are now the Joe Biden movement. No, it isn't the Joe Biden movement. And it was never the Bernie Sanders movement. It's the not me, us movement. It's the political revolution movement. Bernie is just the person we chose to lead the movement, so it's not the Bernie Sanders movement. And there wasn't a movement behind Pete Buttigieg. There were some voters. There wasn't a movement behind Kamala Harris. There were some voters. I mean, there weren't very many. She wasn't able to stay in the race. Kirsten Gillibrand spoke in terms of the women's movement, but she couldn't get any serious support. So the movements were not behind these other people. And one movement after another, I should say movement leader, because no movement is a single unitary thing. But one movement leader after another would come out in support of either Warren or Bernie. The movement leaders were not supporting. There were no climate groups that said Kamala Harris has the best climate plan. There were no healthcare. There were no healthcare groups that weren't industry groups that said Joe Biden had the best healthcare plan. Were industries behind those candidates, not movements. So I was so fucking offended by that ad. And that's the kind of bullshit that the movement can't put up with. Which is, and again, now I am talking about the larger progressive movement. It cannot allow itself to be co-opted as a whole. And the smaller movements within the broader movement can't be co-opted. The Democrats co-opted the Fight for 15 movement when they passed their $15 an hour legislation in the House. It was one of the first things they passed in 2019, the new Democratic House. But that $15 an hour plan that they passed gets to $15 an hour in 2025. By 2025, does anyone really think $15 an hour is going to be enough? No. So now the Fight for 15 theoretically got what they wanted. In Los Angeles, it's already $15. They got it done in LA a long time ago. And it finally kicked in 2020, where I would argue it should be at least $20 or $25 today. Studies have shown there is not a single real estate market in America where you can rent a one bedroom on $15 an hour. So it's not enough. So the movement for a living wage has been co-opted, and now they say, well, we don't have to worry about that right now, when in fact the movement for a living wage needs to be fighting for $25 an hour in the hopes that we get it by 2025. So I hate it when, another example is, I'm glad the Democrats who came to believe in gay marriage, I'm glad that they arrived when they did. Joe Biden was first before Hillary Clinton or Barack Obama. And I think Obama was before Hillary, But, Bernie Sanders supported LGBTQIA rights in the 70s. He had a gay rights parade in Burlington, or is it the 80s? In the 80s, I guess. He had a gay rights parade in Burlington that almost cost him the next election. So, he was there all along because the movement was there all along. We don't necessarily need politicians who are part of movements. Bernie has been a part of all of these movements. We need politicians who can be swayed by movements. That's what we really need. And we need messaging that can sway the public. Some movement leaders, like Greta Thunberg or Wendell Potter, seem completely implacable. That's good. I hope they stay that way. We can compromise on method. We can compromise on messaging. We must find new messaging. But we can't give up until we have Medicare for all. And honestly, I'm starting to think about a national health program like the NHS in the UK, because I'm not sure Medicare for all is good enough in the face of this pandemic. But that's another story for another day. We need a Green New Deal. The planet can't survive. We need a Green New Deal. We need to legalize marijuana and get people out of prison who are there on drug convictions, on nonviolent drug convictions. I saw a guy who served 27 years for crack cocaine, died in prison of COVID-19. He was 47 fucking years old. I'm 47 fucking years old. And I wasn't smoking crack 27 years ago, but I was smoking a lot of weed. And yes, I saw the story, and the dude was black, and I have white privilege, and he doesn't. And God damn it. Legalize cannabis, decarceral efforts, criminal justice reform, true living wage, like I just was talking about, a federal jobs guarantee, or a UBI, or both. More on that on another day. Comprehensive and humane immigration reform, free public college, university, and trade schools, student debt and medical debt cancellation, and so on. So we have to keep those goals. Those are what I would identify as short-term progressive movement goals. Socialists agree with that direction, but for socialists, that's incrementalism. That progressive agenda is the incrementalism. Incrementalism provided by the corporate Democrats is nothing, or almost nothing to a socialist, or at least this socialist. Look, this pandemic has everyone seemingly doubling down on their politics. Right-wingers are becoming more far right-wing. The kind of corporate Republicans and corporate Democrats are doubling down. I mean, Joe Biden, in the middle of the pandemic said he would veto Medicare for all. If it passed the House and Senate, he would veto it. It's obvious that everyone needs health care. God damn it. How many people didn't see a doctor and went on and spread COVID-19 because they didn't have health care? There are 30 million people without insurance in this country and 87 million underinsured. The Republican leadership has doubled down on kleptocracy, let's not forget, and the Democrats to an extent as well. And as I see it all, obviously libertarianism should be dead at this point. I think this pandemic proves you need government to the limited extent. Well, let's not look at the federal government. Let's look at the state governments. And this is a slight tangent. I apologize, but I'm stoned. I should stop reminding you of that, huh? But and I forgot what I was going to say. So I just saved you that tangent. Fuck, what was I going to say? I think this tells me that it's time to end this live stream. I know what I was going to say. So I look at all of the political ideologies. I look at the far right, the xenophobic right, the alt-right, whatever you want to call it, the Fox News right. All of these are slightly different. The House and Senate Republicans, the discourse on CNN, the discourse on MSNBC. And I don't feel like they are presenting ideas that meet the scope of the tragedy. They're not presenting ideas that meet the crisis. The idea that we already discussed an hour ago, that Mitch McConnell wants to let the states go bankrupt, is absurd. It's just absurd. So we see that they're not providing solutions. The only people talking about real solutions that will help real people are progressives. Bernie Sanders says we're winning the war of ideas, and I hope he's right. I just don't know. I just don't know. I mean, obviously we know the polling. We know that most of these issues poll over 60%, certainly over 50%. I mean, there are polls that have Medicare for all over 80% with the Democratic Party and over 50% with the Republican Party. Anyway, if ever there's a time for the movement, it's now. We can't be in the streets. I respect the right of the protesters to protest the state staying closed. I respect the right to protest. I respect the right to assemble. I respect the right to free speech. I just think they're stupid for not social distancing and not wearing masks. But I respect their right to do it. And unfortunately, they're going to get people killed. Wow, I'm really fucking rambling. All right, y'all. That's it. I got my Thursday night show in. It just took me until Friday afternoon to do it. Thank you so much for hanging out with me. We had a lot of viewers in and out of the stream, but it felt good. I'm stoked. I hope you had a good time. And I'll see you Monday night at 11 o'clock Eastern, 8 o'clock Pacific. Please subscribe and hit the like button. Cheers.